My grandmother died on the Tuesday in November, and by Thursday, my sister had already called the estate lawyer. I didn't find that out until later. At the time, I was still sitting in my Nan's kitchen in Barrie, surrounded by her teacups and the smell of the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer, trying to figure out how to feel. 3 years. I'd spent 3 years driving up that highway every weekend, every holiday, every time the home care worker called to say she'd had a bad night. My husband Joel had done it with me without a single complaint. We'd rearranged our whole life around her schedule. Her dialysis appointments, her medication changes, the time she fell in February and I stayed for 11 days straight because she was scared to be alone. My sister lived 40 minutes away and visited maybe 6 times in those 3 years. I counted. I'm not proud of that, but I counted. Her name is not important. What she did is, my grandmother had a trust. Our grandfather set it up before he passed about $340,000, most of it from the sale of their property in Collingwood, invested carefully over 2 decades. Nan had always told me it would be split between my sister and me when she was gone. She said it at Christmas. She said it on my birthday. She said it once in her kitchen while we were making butter tarts. And she grabbed my hand and told me she saw how hard I worked and she wanted me to know it wasn't going unnoticed. What I did not know is that 4 months before she died, my sister had driven up to Barrie, one of her rare visits, and sat with our grandmother alone for an afternoon. I was at work. Joel was at work. Nobody told us she was coming. 2 months after the funeral, the estate lawyer's office called to schedule a reading of the will. I remember thinking that was a strange way to put it. A reading. Like something out of a movie, but that's what they called it. And so Joel and I drove downtown to a glass office building and sat across from a man with wire-rimmed glasses who read my grandmother's last wishes in a flat, careful voice. My sister got everything, all $340,000, plus the jewelry, plus the china set that had been in our family for 4 generations. I got a handwritten note that said she loved me and was proud of me, and a request that I take care of the lavender sachets because she'd made them herself. I sat in that chair and I did not cry. I felt something cold move through me, from my chest out to my fingertips. Joel reached over and put his hand on mine, and I held on to it very hard. My sister sat across the table and did not look at me once. The justification in the will was 2 sentences long. It said that I had been compensated through room, board, and financial support during my caregiving period, and that the trust would therefore pass in full to my sister. I had never received $1 from my grandmother. Not one. She had offered many times, and I had refused every time because that is not why I was there. I was there because she was my grandmother, and she needed someone, and I loved her. On the drive home, Joel didn't say much. He knows me well enough to know when I need silence. When we got back to our apartment, he made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I stared out the window at the street for a long time. Then I said, "She was there alone with her. 4 months ago." Joel said, "I know. She changed the will." "We don't know that for certain." Joel. He looked at me. "I know," he said again. Here is what my sister had done, as we would piece together over the following weeks. She had visited our grandmother during a period when Nan's cognition was declining. Her doctor had noted it in records as early as the previous spring. My sister had arrived alone on a weekday, without telling anyone. She had apparently suggested to my grandmother that because I was basically living there, I had been receiving some form of compensation, and that it was only fair the will reflect that. My grandmother, who was 84 and exhausted and probably lonely in ways none of us fully understood, had agreed to sign updated documents that my sister had conveniently brought with her. I want to be careful here about what I say, because I am not a lawyer and I have learned not to speak in absolutes about things I cannot prove. But here is what we found out. The documents had been prepared by a notary my sister had hired independently. My grandmother's own lawyer, the one who had prepared the original trust documents, had not been involved. And under Ontario's Succession Law Reform Act, there are very specific provisions around testamentary capacity and the validity of changes made under suspicious circumstances. I found a lawyer. Her name was Patricia, and she came recommended through a legal clinic in the city, and she was the most quietly terrifying person I had ever met, which was exactly what I needed. She listened to everything I told her. She took notes. When I finished, she looked at her notepad for a moment, and then she looked at me and said, "Do you have documentation of your caregiving? Calendars, texts, medical appointment records, anything like that?" I had all of it. 3 years of it. I am an organized person. I had kept records because I am the kind of person who keeps records. Not because I was building a case, but because that is just who I am. I had a Google Calendar going back to the fall of 3 years prior, with every single visit logged. I had texts from the home care agency. I had parking receipts from the hospital. I had emails from her GP's office coordinating appointments. Patricia looked at the folder I slid across her desk and said, "Good." I told her I was worried about the cost. I was 31 years old. I worked in municipal planning, and Joel was a high school teacher. We were not poor, but we were also not people who could casually spend $40,000 on litigation. She told me her firm sometimes took cases like this on contingency when the evidence was strong. She would not promise anything, but she would review everything and let me know. She called 2 weeks later and said she wanted to move forward. I called my mother that same night. This is the part that still makes me tired to think about. My mother is not a bad person. I need to say that because it is true. But she has always, for as long as I can remember, defaulted to keeping the peace at whatever cost. When we were growing up, if my sister and I had a conflict, my mother's response was almost always some version of, "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." My sister learned early that this instinct could be used. When I told my mother what was happening, that I had hired a lawyer, that I was contesting the will, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said she thought maybe I should think about whether this was really what Nan would have wanted. I said, "She told me in her kitchen that the money would be split between us." My mother said, "Families don't need to go to court. This is going to tear everyone apart." I said, "Something already tore this apart. I'm just the one naming it." She didn't have a response to that. We got off the phone and I sat in the bathroom for about 10 minutes by myself before I went back out to where Joel was waiting. "How did she take it?" he said. He said, "She's scared," I said. "She doesn't want conflict." "What do you want?" I thought about my grandmother's kitchen. The lavender sachets, the butter tarts, the way she had looked at me when she said she saw how hard I worked. "I want what she actually meant for me to have," I said. The following months were not easy. I will not pretend they were. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being in a legal dispute with your own family. My sister stopped responding to my texts. My mother sent a few messages asking if we could sit down and talk about this without lawyers, as though the lawyers were the problem and not the thing that had made the lawyers necessary. My father, who had been divorced from my mother for years and was mostly on the periphery of all of this, called once to say he was sorry and that he thought I was doing the right thing. That call mattered more than I expected it to. My friends were incredible. My closest friend, who had known my grandmother almost as long as I had, and had driven up to visit her with me more than once, sat with me through some of my worst nights and never once told me to let it go. When I apologized once for talking about it constantly, she looked at me like I had said something ridiculous and told me to stop apologizing for having a legitimate crisis. There is something I want to say about what that period does to you. You question yourself constantly. You lie awake at 2 a.m., thinking, "Am I the selfish one? Am I making this about money when it should be about grief? Would Nan want this?" You turn the same questions over and over until they stop meaning anything. And then morning comes, and you get up and you think about that afternoon in the kitchen and the way she held your hand. And you just know. Patricia had identified several grounds for the challenge. First, the question of my grandmother's capacity at the time the new documents were signed. The medical records from that period were significant, and a geriatric specialist we consulted was prepared to speak to the cognitive decline that had been documented. Second, the circumstances of the signing itself. No independent legal counsel, no witness who was not arranged by my sister, a notary with no prior relationship to my grandmother. Third, and this was the piece that changed everything, my grandmother had told her own GP, during an appointment 3 months before her death, that she was worried she had made a mistake with the will and didn't know how to fix it. That note was in her medical file. It had been there the whole time. When Patricia shared that with me, I sat in her office and did not say anything for almost a full minute. She said, "This is significant." I said, "She knew." "It appears so." My grandmother had known something was wrong. She had been confused, probably frightened, possibly too tired to fight it. She had told her doctor and then she had died before anything could be corrected. And sitting in that office, I felt something I can only describe as both devastating and clarifying. She had not betrayed me. She had been let down too. My sister's lawyer made an offer before we got to a full hearing. It was not a good offer. It was roughly a quarter of my share of the original trust, framed as a settlement to avoid litigation costs, which Patricia described to me with the particular tone lawyers use when they are being professional about something they find insulting. I said no. 3 weeks later, they came back with a better offer. I said no again. The mediation process, when it finally happened, was one of the stranger days of my life. We sat in a boardroom, my sister on one side with her lawyer, me on the other with Patricia, and a mediator who was calm and measured and clearly had done this many times before. My sister did not make eye contact with me for the first 2 hours. At one point, she said through her lawyer that she had believed what she was told about the compensation arrangement and had acted in good faith. I let Patricia handle the response to that. By the end of the day, we had reached an agreement. I will not share the exact number. I was advised not to, but I will say that it was meaningfully close to what the original trust split would have been, plus reimbursement for a portion of the legal fees. It was not everything. It was not justice in the pure and satisfying way you imagine justice when you are lying awake at 2 a.m. But it was recognition. It was documentation, on paper, signed and witnessed, that something wrong had happened and was being corrected. I called my father on the way home. He picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" he said. I told him. There was a pause, and then he said, Good for you." I didn't call my mother that day. I texted her the next morning to say the matter had been resolved and I hoped we could talk eventually. She replied with a short message saying she was glad it was over and that she loved me. I appreciated that more than I could explain. It wasn't everything I might have hoped for, but it was something. My sister and I have not spoken since. I don't know if we will. I have thought about it more than I probably should. I think about what it would take, whether there is some version of this where she could say what she did, plainly and without qualification, and whether that would be enough. I don't have an answer. What I know is that I am not waiting for it. I am not holding my life in suspension while I wait for her to do something she may never do. Joel and I used part of the settlement to pay down our mortgage. A smaller part we set aside for a trip, somewhere we had talked about going for years, the kind of trip you always push to eventually and then never take. We are going in the spring. The rest is in an account that I think of, privately as Nan's account. I don't know yet what we'll do with it. Maybe something practical. Maybe something that would have made her smile. She always said she wanted to see more of the world, and never quite got there. Sometimes I take out the lavender sachet she made. There was one in the pocket of the coat I was wearing the day we cleared out her house, and I kept it, and I just hold it for a minute. She saw how hard I worked. She said so. She told her doctor she thought she had made a mistake. That was enough. That will always be enough.